Hi, I'm Paul Weinberger, Vice President for Congressional Public Affairs at MCC. Thank you for joining our second live televised quarterly town hall. Today, as part of our commitment to transparency, we'll be doing yet another one of these town halls. We do them every quarter after we have our board meetings. It's a chance to talk to you about what our board decided and what MCC is working on. And we'd love to get your feedback, your questions, your ideas. Please send us your questions through Twitter using the hashtag MCC Townhall or via email to events@mcc.gov. Those of you in the room, please at any point write down a question on a card, raise your hand, we'll collect it. And at the end, once we've had the panel talk, we'll have a chance to hear from all of you and answer those questions. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk a bit about the board meeting we had last week and let you know what happened. We had a very productive meeting. We had maybe the most productive meeting we've had ever. The board voted on and approved 2 compacts and 1 threshold, and we also discussed a 4th compact. All in all, there was a total USG investment of over $750 million in fighting poverty that was approved by our board. Specifically, that includes a $450 million compact with Morocco, focused on high-quality jobs training and land productivity, a $257 million compact with Liberia, focused on power and roads, and a $44 million threshold program with Sierra Leone, focused on the water and electricity sectors. Now, the board was also briefed about a proposed compact with Tanzania. That's a $473 million investment in Tanzania's power sector. The board expressed support for the design and goal of the compact, but it also expressed continued concern about corruption in Tanzania, which is an issue the board has discussed before. And ultimately, the board decided that it would defer voting on the compact until after we know whether or not Tanzania passes the Control of Corruption indicator, which is one of the 20 indicators on our annual scorecard, and we'll find out the result in the coming days and weeks. One other thing I should mention, the board also approved the procedures that will govern its selection of new partner countries in December, and we'll hear a bit more about what that means in just a second. So to talk about all these issues today, I'd like to introduce our panel. Today we'll hear from Evan Freund, Liberia Country Team Lead, Ariane Gaucher, the Morocco Country Team Lead, Chris Dunn, who is our Sierra Leone Country Team Lead and also our new Deputy Chief of Staff. Sam Kwan is the Acting Practice Lead for Energy at MCC. He'll talk about the Tanzania compacts and also more generally about our energy sector portfolio. And lastly, we are joined by Chris Maloney from our Department of Policy and Evaluation, who will talk about the selection process I just mentioned. Thank you all for joining us today, and let's get started. As we look at these 4 new programs I talked about, we can see some common themes beyond the fact that all 4 of them are in Africa. One of them that comes to mind is they are all relatively ambitious in terms of sectoral impacts. They all aim to reach beyond a particular project and to leverage MCC's investment to bring about systemic change in the relevant sector, whether it's power, water, land, or education. Secondly, related to that, we also see all of them, at least all the compacts, combine large infrastructure investments with specific and policy and institutional reforms in order to maximize gains. And thirdly, they all include specific requirements tied to funding, both upfront and in the program itself, that are intended to make sure that we incentivize reforms and that those reforms are indeed sustainable and long-lasting. And lastly, 3 of the programs are heavily focused on the energy sector. So I wanted to give the panel a chance to talk about all those points, and let's start with the last one, which is why MCC is focusing on energy so much. You may have noticed, if you've attended these town halls in the past, we've been talking a lot about energy. We've recently approved compacts with Benin and Ghana that are focused on energy. And MCC has said that it will invest $2 billion in the Power Africa initiative in power generation, transmission, distribution, and household connections. I'd like to ask Sam, our energy sector lead, to talk a bit about why is MCC focusing so much on energy these days?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Paul. I think there's a number of reasons. Let's start from the top. MCC begins its analysis on what to do in a country by performing a constraints analysis. And when we do that in a lot of these countries, power, or specifically lack of supply of reliable power, comes up often as a binding constraint to their economic growth, which makes us look at that area. And then, of course, the country ownership. The countries themselves have been asking increasingly for our help in looking at their energy sector, especially the power issues, and then delving into solving that problem with them. Now, I think one of the reasons that's happening is because of Power Africa, which gave us a bit of prominence in the fact that USG as a whole is willing to invest in power, especially in increasing access and bringing more megawatts on the ground. And then finally, I think when you look at the power sector, there is money there available, especially for generation in the form of, say, independent power producers and other project finance providers, whether debt or equity, to invest in the power sector. The result being the government is able to free up some of its money for other uses. So we see an opportunity there not only to work with the private sector by unlocking the private sector investment into generation and other parts of power sector value chain, but also to do that through working with the government to implement certain reforms that remove barriers to private sector investment. I think these are some of the high-level reasons why we've been invited to look at the power sector of these countries, and we've in fact chosen to go into the power sector and make some of these investments.
And can you tie that a bit to the proposed compact in Tanzania? How does that actually reflect some of these themes you've been talking about?
Sure. So just as was the case with, say, Ghana or Benin, in Tanzania for the second compact, we've identified power, or again specifically lack of supply of reliable power, as one of the constraints to binding constraints to economic growth of the country. As a result, we started looking at it, and then we came up with a program that has roughly two elements. On the hard infrastructure side, we're looking at investment into distribution, especially around the urban regions near Dar. And that's because there's a lot of people there who are living within a few kilometers of the last distribution pole, but they're not yet connected. They're not consuming electricity. Chances are they are the poorer of the population who live in that area. So we would like to go in, and what we're proposing is to go in there and then help connect those folks that are in the urban areas near where there's already grid. And by doing so, we allow people to consume electricity, and that has benefits in terms of them having savings, and then that allows them to put that into productive uses. It also has a softer component, and that relates to engaging with the private sector. In a kind of a unique way, the Tanzanian government, in the middle of last year, adopted a roadmap for reform of their entire power sector. It's a very ambitious 10-year plan that includes reshaping the entire electricity market to introduce wholesale competition, and that in turn leads to unbundling the generation business unit of TANESCO, which is their government-owned vertically integrated utility. It also involves introducing new actors, such as an independent system operator, independent market operator. It includes strengthening their regulator, EWURA, so that it is able to in fact regulate the flow of electricity as well as flow of funds in that sector. And when we saw that, and all of that is designed to really encourage the private sector to come in by creating a level playing field for competition, so that private sector IPPs would look at the market and say, you know what, we may be able to compete with government-owned generators. You know what, the rules are clear. And of course, the power buyer, which in the industry is called off-taker, is getting stronger financially. So we are getting behind the government's reform roadmap, and we would like to help them realize their objectives, which is create a market for competition, make it inviting for the private sector to come in with generation investment, and make TANESCO, which is the current buyer, stronger, so that it'll be a better business partner and a counterpart to power purchase agreements under these deals. The last element, of course, is Zanzibar, where we're doing a similar approach. We are going to help the Zanzibaris stand up their regulator for the first time for their power sector. And then we are actually introducing an interesting type of private sector participation in the operation and management of its distribution utility, ZECO. And for now, our plan is to introduce a management contractor to bring a bit of a private sector discipline in operating that distribution utility to improve its performance again, to make it a better business partner for the sector as a whole. So that's the gist of the Tanzania Compact, and I think that's how it fits with the way we look at power sector generally in any country.
Thank you, Sam. And Evan, I'd love to hear, how does the Liberia Compact compare, and how is it similar, and also its focus on energy?
Sure, thanks. So as Sam noted, when we began our partnership with the government of Liberia, we undertook a joint constraints analysis to look at the binding constraints to economic growth in Liberia. Not surprisingly, electricity, power, and really specifically the access or lack of access to reliable and affordable electricity emerged as a key binding constraint to economic growth in Liberia. The statistics in the energy sector in Liberia are quite staggering. Fewer than 2% of the population of about 4 million people actually have access to grid-supplied electricity. Liberia has arguably the highest electricity tariff in the world at 52 cents per kilowatt hour. And its utility, the Liberia Electricity Corporation, is operating with about 22 megawatts of installed generation capacity, all of which is driven by very old, very expensive to maintain, and frankly polluting diesel generator sets, which really is tremendously inefficient at this point in time to service a growing population, and a population that's now much more centered in and around Monrovia, the capital, than it has been historically. So MCC and the government of Liberia worked together in developing this constraints analysis, and subsequently to identify projects and areas for investment through the compact. It quickly emerged in our conversations with the government that a primary area of focus for MCC was to work in partnership with the government and other sector stakeholders, principally a set of donors, to help support the development of a key piece of generation infrastructure, which is the Mount Coffee hydropower facility. The Mount Coffee hydropower facility is an 88 megawatt facility which has been in the process of rehabilitation for the last 2 years. It will be, once complete, again, a linchpin piece of power generation infrastructure for Liberia, and frankly a real game changer in terms of the generation mix, and a big factor in helping promote the reduction of the tariff, which, as I mentioned, is extraordinarily high at the moment. The Mount Coffee facility existed and was actually first constructed in the 60s and almost completely destroyed during Liberia's prolonged civil war. The rehabilitation of the hydropower plant is frankly a key government priority for Liberia, and an important opportunity for MCC to work with a number of sector stakeholders, not just the government of Liberia, but the governments of Norway and Germany, as well as the European Investment Bank, to support the rehabilitation of a linchpin piece of generation infrastructure. There's a lot of investment in the electricity sector in Liberia coming online over the next 18 to 24 months, both on the generation side and on the transmission and distribution side. And it was an important part of our analysis to understand that we could be a player and be supportive of the electricity sector, and working with the government to help diversify the generation mix, participate in the growth of the sector and the expansion of the transmission and distribution lines outside of downtown Monrovia, if you will, and contribute to an environment where ultimately Liberians are enjoying a reduced tariff, and as a result seeing an opportunity to increase real growth, sustainable growth. So the MCC Compact really focuses on our participation in the rehabilitation of the Mount Coffee Hydro Facility, but a number of our efforts in the Compact complement our investments in that hardware, in that civil works infrastructure. We've worked quite closely with the government in the development of the program to design activities that really support policy reform and institutional development, principally with the two key institutions that support the sector. That is the Liberia Electricity Corporation, or LEC, and the Ministry of Lands, Mines, and Energy. And a number of activities in the Compact are really aimed to help support a sustainable growth plan and management plan, both for the utility moving forward and for the sector more broadly, as it moves away from a limited generation portfolio to one that's a bit more diversified, and it has an opportunity to expand as a result of a reduced tariff. So we're quite excited to be participating both in the rehabilitation of such a key piece of generation infrastructure, and to work quite closely with a number of important partners of Liberia in strengthening the sector and helping it modernize and become really a more efficient, more modern, and growth-oriented sector, and one that can ultimately attract private sector investment in the medium to long term.
Thanks, Evan. And staying in West Africa, I'd like to bring in Chris Dunn to talk a bit about the Sierra Leone program, and maybe to flag not just the energy focus, but also the fact that it is a threshold program, a smaller program, and how that might be different from our compacts.
Sure, great. Thanks, Paul, and thank you to everybody. I think, as Paul alluded to, Sierra Leone is a threshold program. MCC's threshold program is intended to help countries become eligible for our compact assistance, typically through working with governments to identify and implement tough, politically tough institutional reforms in sectors or areas of binding constraint. So the programs are typically smaller, typically focus on institutional capacity building, technical assistance, and reform, less on infrastructure. But nevertheless, the issues that drove us to identify access to electricity are very similar to the points that Sam and Evan raised. Threshold programs also begin with an analysis of binding constraints to growth. And like in Tanzania and like in Liberia and Sierra Leone, access to reliable and affordable electricity, as well as access to safe water, emerged as very clear binding constraints. In Sierra Leone, again, as in Liberia, the constraint is really driven by a reliance, insufficient supply and low access levels, which drive up costs and result in a reliance on sort of off-grid or more costly power sources. Again, to sort of provide some statistics of how this works, Sierra Leone has access levels of about 6% nationally, but that's really 1% in rural areas and something about 13% in urban areas. That's about 100,000 connections for a population of 6 million people. And some of our stats show that 82% of firms in Sierra Leone actually own or share a generator. They just can't rely on grid-based power to operate their businesses. And I think, importantly, tariffs are high. In fact, actually in Sierra Leone, they are, I think, 2 times the continental average for consumers. But again, in the context of the threshold program, what was important for us was to identify how policy and institutional constraints or issues exacerbate or contribute to these problems. And I think both in the water sector, which I'll talk about a little bit later, in the electricity sector, there are many. And in Sierra Leone, we really started to look at weak utility management, an absence of regulation, ill-defined roles and responsibilities, and really low revenue collection by the distribution utility, which is attributable really to technical losses, but also commercial losses, theft, and inefficiencies. And so I think there are really 2 elements of the threshold program that are focused on trying to work with the government on these constraints in the electricity sector. The first is our regulatory strengthening project, which is working with the government of Sierra Leone at what is really an exciting time in Sierra Leone for the electricity sector as they work to implement a reform agenda. They recently established a electricity and water regulatory commission, and under the threshold program, we're going to be working with that commission to build core capacities and really build out a framework for regulated tariff setting in a regulated sector. In addition, there is an electricity sector reform project. That project is foundationally intended to help the government operationalize its recent decision to unbundle the electricity sector, to take the vertically integrated parastatal and create one electricity transmission and generation company and one distribution and supply authority. That project is both looking at helping increase overall governance by helping align roles and responsibilities and improving coordination mechanisms, but also working across these institutions to help strengthen integrated planning capacity and provided some targeted technical assistance for particularly the transmission and generation company moving forward. I think, as I said and others alluded to, I think one of the exciting features of MCC's work in Sierra Leone is the extent to which we're really trying to take and leverage the government's own reform agenda. This is a plan that the government put in place actually a few years ago in terms of fundamentally reorienting their electricity sector and establishing a regulatory environment that could both attract and really sustain investment in the sector. And what we're trying to do is work with them to help operationalize that and make that effective so that we can really build a foundation for more effective and financially sustainable electricity as well as water services in the country. So with that, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chris. And I think we've already started to get into One other theme I mentioned, which is MCC's desire to bring about systemic change in a particular sector. And I want to bring in Ariane to talk about the Morocco Compact and how we see that happening there.
Sure. So it's a challenge to describe this compact in just a few minutes, so I'll give a brief overview and then happy to answer more questions later on in the session. So first in Morocco, we built off of a very strong relationship established with the government of Morocco and the people of Morocco during our first program there. We, I think, are lucky to come in at a time of a lot of political will around reform and a really willingness to have transparent dialogue with stakeholders around key issues facing the country. We focused in on two binding constraints: education quality and land productivity. On the education side, it's obviously a vast sector, a big challenge in every country, challenges from preschool through higher education. So we really focused in on a couple of subsectors, secondary and workforce development, where we saw that there was the tightest employability link and direct income impact, as well as where there was the best opportunity for MCC to have value added given the landscape of other donors. On the secondary side, we will be piloting and rigorously evaluating a new employability school model, which is focused on improving students' basic competencies needed for the workforce, and a couple of features I think that are innovative to describe the program approach. We'll be introducing school performance contracts for the first time that give performance incentives for schools that are performing well vis-a-vis their students. We'll be introducing with the government a new approach to operations and maintenance, where the question of periodic maintenance for schools has not been systematically addressed. And we're supporting a very strong commitment from the government of Morocco to better assessment of the system to really support data-driven policy in the education sphere. So practically, we'll be looking at rehabilitating and providing technical assistance to between 90 and 110 secondary schools, so both at the middle and high school level, in 3 regions in Morocco, and really creating a model that can be scaled by the government. I'll highlight that this is very much in line with the government's new education strategy, which has just been publicly issued in the last few weeks, where I think the government again has taken a hard look at the sector and created an ambitious policy reform agenda through 2030. On the workforce development side, we'll be creating a grant facility to support public-private partnerships in training in order to increase employment rates and income over the traditional public training model. This is a concept that we tested during compact development. We issued a call for ideas for public-private partnerships to provide vocational training, and we received an overwhelming response. I think from some folks in the room were involved in that, and we got a good response from international players, local players, more than 260 proposals received. So that was a huge help to us to justify a strong budget in our compact to support this type of partnership, and also to help us as we put parameters around how we could shape our partnerships in this area. This facility mechanism is an important kind of paradigm shift, really helping the government as well think about how they finance this sector. And so we're creating a facility that will be primarily MCC financed in the beginning, but will evolve over the compact term to incorporate government financing, and the idea is that this facility will outlive the compact. To support women and at-risk youth, where we found that even where they receive the appropriate training, they face particular issues in accessing work opportunities. We're piloting a results-based financing approach to incentivize effective employment services for these populations. So we're exploring piloting a social impact bond, and I can again go into that more in the Q&A, where we would be bringing in private sector investors and really strictly paying out against outcomes in terms of employment access for those populations. On the land side, the fundamental issue is challenges in terms of productivity to land. The country faces challenges in terms of having a cohesive national land strategy, and we found that particularly on the rural land side and industrial land side, investment was very much constrained in those areas. So we'll be doing providing support to the government of Morocco to develop a comprehensive, cohesive national roadmap on land strategies. Again, supporting government efforts in this area to start really taking a cohesive look at this issue. On the rural land side, we're supporting the government in moving collective land from government to private ownership through a faster, fairer, more transparent model with the objective of increasing agricultural productivity. So we'll be piloting in this approach in one region, again, in a manner that can be scaled by the government elsewhere. On the industrial side, we're supporting a government shift from a state-driven industrial zone model to a market-driven approach that brings in the private sector as operators and is able to better meet the the needs of private sector enterprises locating in these zones. So again, highlighting, I think, these approaches to focusing on outcomes and results, bringing in the private sector in terms of creative solutions, in addition to civil society, has very much been part of this, this dialogue throughout. Thanks.
Thanks, Ariane. Clearly, we're looking at more than one sector in Morocco. And I want to just bring in the rest of the panel as well to talk about sectoral impacts in their respective compacts and how we envision that. Sam, Evan, and Chris.
Sure. As I was previewing the Tanzania compact, the entire compact, the 473 million that we programmed so far is for the power sector. So all our funds are going into the power sector, and our larger dollars, which is tied to the distribution projects they were contemplating, is in part conditioned on some of the actions to be taken by the government. And they have in fact been brought to the board because government has already taken actions that satisfied us that it is committed to reforming the sector. And I think that's the key. We can't reform any country's sector on our own. I don't think any of the development partners even together could do that. What it takes ultimately is the government's willingness to make tough choices and tough decisions, whether it is to restructure their, in my case, the power market, or reform the roles and responsibilities of various power sector institutions, or whether it is to raise the tariff, if that's what's necessary, so that it's cost reflective and full. So these are the tough decisions, and in Tanzania's context, the government has, in writing, committed to a 10-year plan to reform their sector and accomplish all these things, which was difficult in and of itself. Now it's going to be, I think, just as hard, if not harder, to pull this off. But we believe the vision that they have for 2025, where there is sufficient electricity, right now, if their projections hold, we're talking about at least 1,000 megawatt per year between now and 2025 that need to come online to meet the projected demand if they want to be on that growth path under Tanzania Vision 2025. We believe the roadmap that they have does pave the way for that kind of growth in the sector, in the power sector. We believe the government has, at least in its vision, previewed the tough choices that need to be made, and they have in fact taken steps to implement some of these visions and these reform strategy. So that's why we're getting behind it, and we will work together if the board approves our compact at the right time to continue to help the government implement it and basically allow them to achieve what it set out to achieve, because it is consistent with what we would like to see for their development objectives.
Yeah, thank you. I think the same holds true in Liberia in many respects. Our goal is to work with the government to promote a sustainable, transparent, well-managed growth plan for the electricity sector as additional investment comes in, initially largely by other sector stakeholders, other donors, but in the future by private sector investors as well. And in working with the government to achieve these objectives, I think there were really two key elements of the sector that we collectively focused on and worked on together. And the first was sort of harmonizing or developing an electricity law that was consistent with sort of the state of the sector today. The electricity law that currently exists in Liberia is a bit outdated, and it really doesn't allow for or encompass all of the necessary requirements that one would expect to see as the sector diversifies and grows and additional consumers are brought onto the grid. So as a milestone, if you will, very much in partnership with the government through the development of the compact. We worked quite closely on really revising the electricity law and bringing it into a shape that looks like it will work for the sector over the longer term. And really a key element of the law is the development, and I think this is quite consistent, frankly, with some of the work we're doing in Sierra Leone as well, is the development of an independent regulator, which is something that obviously can't be created overnight, but certainly critical over the longer term to effectively manage the sector and deal with issues like tariff changes, for example, consumer protection, sector governance, and at the moment, the existing law didn't call for the development of an independent regulator. So one of the key features of the new law, and frankly through our support in the compact, is to develop the scope and ultimately the institution itself, this regulatory function, so that over time it becomes an autonomous entity within Liberia that can help manage and effectively deal with sector issues and appropriately manage investments and changes to the sector as it grows. The second, I think, again, in line with sustainability issues, is management of the utility itself. And again, specifically in the case of Liberia, LEC, the Liberian Electricity Corporation, is a very small utility operating a very limited set of assets. But hopefully that will change over time, and the expectation is obviously that it will grow over time. And professional management, sustainable management of the utility is quite critical. Our goal in working with the government, as it identified a need to think about future management, was to work with them to develop a set of options that may work best for LEC in the future. And this is an ongoing process that we've been engaged in really since the outset of our relationship in developing the program. But to work through in a very detailed way a set of options for future management arrangements of the Liberia Electricity Corporation that can best deal with the additional generation infrastructure that LEC will need to manage, as well as the additional transmission generation and connections that will come online over the 18-24-month, 3-year period. And so these are big milestones that we've woven into the compact itself, again, very much in partnership with the government as it recognizes the potential for growth and new opportunities that are emerging in the sector over the next few years. And obviously important elements of the program that we'll continue to track and be quite closely affiliated with as we move forward. I do also want to mention, just to deviate momentarily from the electricity sector, the same holds true in the road sector. While the roads component of the Liberia Compact is relatively small as compared to the electricity component, this struck us as a great opportunity to work in a very critical sector that too is developing and evolving quite rapidly. Much of Liberia's road network at present is unpaved. And the government itself hasn't yet really established a comprehensive mechanism for periodic and routine maintenance of this network. For those of you who have worked in or spent some time in Liberia and this part of the world more generally, it experiences extraordinary rainfall and sustained rainfall for about 6 months of the year, which really has an incredible impact in deteriorating the road network. It's quite difficult to maintain such a large stretch of unpaved roads. Only about a little more than 6% of the road network in Liberia is paved. And the financing required, in addition to the actual resources required for maintaining the largely unpaved portion of the road network, is extraordinary on an annual basis. So we've been working quite closely with the government to help them think about and start the process for developing a more comprehensive, more holistic road maintenance program. And that includes capturing of revenues through fuel levies and licensing fees, and dedicating those revenues to both periodic and routine maintenance over time. And the key feature of this, from a milestone standpoint, if you will, with respect to the compact, is the development and passage of a Road Fund Act, which is working its way through the legislature in Liberia at present, and once passed, will really create the conditions for and the foundations of a national road fund and a road fund agency, which will be able to do just that, to capture revenue through various streams and apply those funds towards periodic and routine maintenance of, again, quite a comprehensive but largely unpaved road network. And again, this is quite critical for connectivity, again, as the economy grows and diversifies, allowing ease of movement and hopefully reduction in transport costs as a result of better maintained, more sustainably maintained, and obviously passable roads for a year-round period is quite critical at this point in Liberia's growth. So we're working, across two sectors on a couple of key sort of reform issues and targeting a couple of key features in those two sectors to really support sustainable growth in them. Thanks.
So while echoing lots of what the other panelists have said, I guess I'll just put a finer point on some of the issues in Sierra Leone. I think, as I said at the outset, the Threshold program is entirely focused on policy and institutional reform efforts and capacity building within government institutions. So in many respects, the whole thrust of the program is on building the capacity of these institutions and or reforming the institutional framework for the delivery of electricity and water services so that there can be a sort of broader sectoral impact on users and a sustained sectoral impact, which I know we're talking about. So in the electricity sector, I mentioned a focus, and as Evan has mentioned, to focus on really building up this independent regulatory functionality, which has never existed, but which the government has taken the first step to do. I think one other key element of what we're trying to do electricity sector side is, in coordination with other development partners and in coordination with the government, really build out an institutional roadmap and market structure for the sector. Now that this unbundling has happened and now that these new institutions have been created, including the regulator, what is it and what is the longer term vision for the sector for getting private sector investment in the sector and increasing generation capacity? And that's a challenge that we'll be working with the government and our development partners on moving forward. And so I've spent a lot of time talking about the electricity sector. I do want to talk briefly about some of our work in the water sector, which is also similarly focused on a broader sectoral impact. The regulator, as I mentioned, is both the electricity and the water sector regulator. So our work on the regulator is foundationally also related to improving accountability, transparency, and long-term tariff setting in the water sector as well. And our goal through the water sector reform project is to really focus on improving the overall governance, performance, and accountability in the water sector, with a particular focus on the Freetown water utility. The water utility in Freetown has an unbelievable challenge, which is trying to provide water to an ever-growing city with a limited supply and an incredibly old, unmapped, unrehabilitated distribution system. Obviously, the Threshold program, and frankly, I would say all development partners working together probably couldn't bring enough donor capital to fully rehabilitate this entire system. And so, what we're trying to do with the government of Sierra Leone and with the water utility is build this technical assistance within the utility, but also provide sort of a demonstration space within which the government and the utility can work on a small segment of the distribution network to combat illegal connections, deploy non-revenue water strategies, work with consumers on understanding and paying the value and paying for water, so we can start to, in a small space, learn some lessons about how that utility can work moving forward and how those lessons can be applied to the broader city of Freetown and greater Freetown, and as well, eventually, we hope, in some of the other urban areas and the other challenges in the country. So there's a real, not to overuse the term foundation, but we're trying to, again, establish some foundation within the water sector where this utility can take some of the technical assistance we want to provide through the program, actually deploy it in a small place, and try to leverage that experience with the government moving forward. Another key element of that in the water sector is some work we're doing on a different model for managing shared public water points. As many of you may know, something like 65% of customers of the Freetown utility access water through something other than a household connection, whether that is a shared water point, a yard water point, even a borehole. This presents huge challenges both to the ability of them to access that safe water, but frankly also the ability of the utility to collect any revenue from people who access water through these sources. And so one of the things we're trying to do, again, on a small scale, so that we can help the government and the utility learn some lessons about what might work, is pilot a new private sector-led model for the management and operation of these small standpipes or public water points. Again, to really experiment with what might be a different model in the context of Freetown and could be used elsewhere. I think one other thing I'll mention in the context of a broader sectoral impact is some work we're trying to do with DFID, UK aid, and the government around really combating perceptions of corruption in the delivery of these essential utility services. Through great coordination, the government of Sierra Leone and DFID are helping to develop a platform, so to speak, a pay no bribe platform through which citizens in Sierra Leone will be able to report on instances of petty corruption or bribery that they experience in a host of different government provided services. And what we're trying to do, both in the electricity sector and in the water sector, both through the regulator and through our technical assistance at the utilities, is really help these institutions use that data in a productive way so that we can get feedback from consumers to transform the way these services are provided and build some accountability into the system. That's both by having the regulator include reports of corruption in these sorts of things and its essential, regular monitoring of utility performance, as well as helping, particularly the water utility, build in some of these accountability mechanisms into their internal procedures. For example, by triggering audits of accounts or investigations based on some reports from this system. So there's a multitude of tools we're trying to use through the program to get at larger sectoral impacts that will, again, attract and sustain investment in the sectors, but also really extend the impacts of our discrete investments.
Thanks, Chris. I mentioned at the outset MCC's willingness to tie specific outcomes to its funding. And MCC also has a reputation for pursuing innovative approaches to development. And I want to have Ariane talk a bit about that. I think you previewed that already, but how do we see that in your compact? And then Chris can talk about Sierra Leone as well.
Sure. So I think one value added of the MCC model is we can really support governments in moving from kind of vision to execution on policy reform. So not just signing the paper in terms of new laws, but how do you get the right either new institutions or institutional reform in place? How do you get different government stakeholders working together towards a common goal, working with the private sector and civil society as partners? So I think MCC provides just a neutral platform in countries to kind of advance the dialogue, again, from the general issues to really how do you practically apply and test these mechanisms on a local level. So a couple of examples in the Morocco case. In the case of workforce development, the government is on its way to passing a new financing law that will reform how continuous vocational training is financed. And so MCC will be providing support to helping the government figure out how to actually orchestrate the financing mechanisms. Who's responsible for what? How do you deal with this new revenue? How do you ensure there aren't conflicts of interest in terms of who's managing this financing, et cetera? So we'll be providing that sort of technical assistance. And then in terms of the practical funding aspect from the MCC side, our facility will be really financing and testing these new models in terms of bringing the private sector in on a competitive basis, measuring their success based on a common set of outcome metrics, and really creating, again, a platform for the government to, I think, make more evidence-based decisions in terms of how they're financing this sector based on actual results, not just on inputs, not just on amount of dollars spent. So that's one example, sort of the different levels that we're working at. I mentioned the social impact bond, and I think that's an interesting and exciting opportunity for both MCC and the government of Morocco in this area of employment services. Big challenges in Morocco and many countries in terms of youth unemployment, and so bringing in the private sector as a partner and again focusing on what are really the most effective mechanisms while allowing some flexibility for innovation in terms of who's involved and how they get the job done as long as the results are achieved. And this is an area where you actually can see outcome results within a couple of year periods, so it lends itself well to to our intervention.
Sorry, Chris.
Thanks. So I guess I'll say, again, just a few things. I mean, in the Threshold program, we tried to rely on a few core principles in designing the program. One, echoing what Ariane said, was to really use the program as an opportunity for the government of Sierra Leone to demonstrate its political will and capacity to implement tough reforms. But I think just as equally, we wanted to give or use the program as an opportunity as a platform really for testing some innovative solutions that could be scaled either by the government, other donors, or even MCC through a potential compact down the road. I've talked about this demonstration activity in the context of the water program, where we're really looking for ideas that could be scaled up in terms of strategies and approaches to getting at some real root cause problems in municipal water service in Freetown, such as theft, commercial losses, non-revenue water. I think one other attribute in sort of results-based financing model that we're trying to roll out in the context of Sierra Leone is trying to leverage and reinforce the role of the regulator by developing, again, a financing model that sees towards the end of the program these utilities institutions really being paid for outcomes as opposed to us paying for technical inputs. So the theory is that we would be building technical capacity throughout the early parts of the program, but then really working with the government to establish a set of key performance indicators that would be regulated by or monitored by the regulator on an ongoing basis. And achievement of increased performance outcomes would really trigger some financing payments to these utilities that would incentivize that improved performance and really ensure that we and the government, again, to echo Ariane's point, are paying for or really supporting the achievement of results and not just the payment of inputs to achieve those results.
And just adding quickly, Paul, I think MCC has always placed a very strong emphasis on monitoring and evaluation and rigor in that sphere. So I think it's a nice complement to our model in terms of, at the same time, building capacity in countries for systems for rigorous, independent assessment of outcomes, which is one of the kind of critical conditions to successfully carrying out these types of approaches.
Great. I want to switch topics now and bring in Chris Maloney. Chris, I mentioned at the outset the board's decision with respect to selection, but maybe before we go there, you can talk a bit about the selection calendar, where we are, and what we can see in the next few months.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Paul. So first, if you can believe it, we're entering MCC's 13th country selection cycle since its founding in 2004. And as usual, the process is going to have 4 distinct steps, 2 of which we've already accomplished. The first is every August we publish the annual candidate country report. So this is basically the list of all low-income and lower middle-income countries that MCC is able to look at. That report was published on our website in August. The next is what the board approved last week. That's the selection criteria and methodology report that just went up on the web a few days ago. Basically, this is the report which says, okay, we have these 80 or so low and lower middle-income countries. How are they going to be evaluated? What sort of policy things are we going to look at? Then next is what my team is working on right now. Over the next month, we're producing MCC's annual country scorecards. These scorecards will be published on the web around the first week of November. They look at policy performance in all low and lower middle income countries in 3 areas. They look at investing in people, ruling justly, and economic freedom. And then finally, of course, the 4th step is the board meeting itself. That will happen probably around the 1st or 2nd week of December. And as usual, the board will look at 3 things. The first, it's going to look at policy performance, primarily as measured by the scorecards, but also as bolstered through supplemental information. It's going to look at the candidates from a lens using the overall sense of the opportunity to reduce poverty and generate growth. And finally, of course, it's going to look at the funding available. So it's a trade-off between all of those factors, and we will see what the board decides when we get to December.
Great. And the particular report that the board approved last week, anything new or noteworthy in that?
Nothing's substantially different from last year. I mean, just to highlight, the selection criteria and methodology report goes in depth into a few main things that we get a lot of questions about annually. The first is just how do the scorecards work? So what data do we use? Where does it come from? Why do we use it? The second is the role of supplemental information. So beyond the scorecards, what else is the board looking at? Why are they looking at it? How do we account for things like data lags, the facts that sometimes our scorecard doesn't capture everything, and how does that come into play? It also goes in depth into the criteria that we use for second compact candidates. So we do have a higher bar for countries that maybe we might be looking at for second compact candidacy. It also looks at the criteria we use for threshold programs as well. For those of you who might have looked at last year's report, it's not substantially different from last year's. The key thing is, just like last year's, we completely overhauled the language so that it's much more, as I'd like to say, not written in Greek. It's much more accessible and a much clearer language that's in there. We do have a new subsection in there on how the board will think about selection for potential regional investments. In this regard, I just want to say overall that the selection process remains exactly the same. But on the piece of supplemental information, for countries where we think there might be high potential opportunities for potential regional investments, there will be additional information provided to the board, and it will look at three things. It will look at the country's basically relations with its neighbors, how integrated is it with its neighbors. It'll look at issues that are hindering further integration, and it will also give a sense of what are the types of opportunities that might be out there. So, why does it make sense to look at regionally at a particular set of countries? So again, basically the same document as last year, but with this added look at the regional lens.
Great, and with that, I want to open this up for questions. Remember, you can tweet us your questions in real time using the hashtag MCC Townhall. You can also send an email to events@mcc.gov. And for those of you here with us today, just write down a question. We have a piece of paper for you. Send it over. We'll have someone pick it up, and we'll read it out. Let me start. We have our first question on Twitter. The question is, MCC is heavily investing in Power Africa. How much of this supports renewables? Sam, do you want to address that?
I'll address that, and then I think one apologies up front. I don't have the exact figures off the top of my at the tip of my tongue, but it's available on our website, and you can look up the exact figures. I think one of the challenges of answering this very question is this: we don't, as MCC, we don't go in there saying you need to do renewables country. As we said, it starts with what's your constraints to economic growth. If it's power, then is it supply of power or is it something else? And to the extent new generation is in fact what's needed, then we ask, typically, what is your least cost generation path? Because these countries desperately need power, and power at a low price if possible. Renewables have come down significantly, especially PV solar, but nonetheless, it's not always the only solution or the most appropriate solution. Having said all these, we do have a number of investments existing in renewable energy. Now, there's some, I'm guessing the questioner had something like wind or solar in mind more than hydro. However, we are doing a rehab of an existing hydro facility in Malawi. And we are in Liberia, obviously, looking at hydro as the major investment. Setting that aside, I think kind of the showcase for us and where all these factors kind of converged perfectly was Benin. There, we are investing potentially 45 to up to, I think, a little over 70 megawatt of photovoltaic power. And we have funds programmed for that. We are currently considering, along with the government, ways to attract IPP as a partner, so that rather than MCC building and handing it over to the government, we would actually transfer some of the risks to the private sector, who would then in turn bring some financing and our technical skills. In Benin as well, there's an off-grid element, both commercial scale solar as well as residential. And I believe it's going to take potentially a shape of a facility where we would go out in different windows and say, our funds are available. Now, how would you like to spend these funds to bring, I think more likely than not, solar power for different parts that are not connected to the main grid? And then last thing that I'll say is, apart from Power Africa countries, which is Sub-Saharan Africa, we take similar route. Currently in Indonesia, we have a Green Prosperity Program where there are windows of funds offered for potential renewable energy projects.
Great. Evan, was there anything you want to add on renewables? Good. I think I'm told we have some questions. I'll ask Lee to read them out.
Thanks, Paul. We have a question from the audience. Given the recent political changes in Guatemala, what is MCC planning for the threshold projects that are being designed?
Yeah, great question. Chris Maloney, are you able to talk a bit about what's going on in Guatemala to give some context to that question?
Sure, just some context. Obviously, there was a large customs scandal that broke earlier this year in the spring, which resulted in the resignation and the prosecution of the vice president, and now also the president, as well as the former president, and of course, the elections were then about 2 weeks ago on Sunday. So we're obviously watching how the rule of law is followed in Guatemala very, very closely. And, I think that's really the key thing. Right now, the process is being followed the way it should. And that's really, from an eligibility standpoint, what we're most interested in seeing.
Thank you. And from a programmatic perspective, there's obviously both a challenge but also an opportunity in Guatemala. And we are closely monitoring to make sure that both we have people on the ground, our counterparts we can work with, but also that we have the opportunity I mentioned is the fact that part of our program would address concerns about corruption, which have obviously been underlying some of the protests we've seen in Guatemala. So this actually might be quite timely. So we will continue to evaluate to make sure the time is right for us, but we hope to move forward as quickly as we can with that program.
Great. Next question from the audience. It seems like the end state of these compacts is to garner private sector investment or participation. At what stage do you begin reaching out to private sector, or do you wait for the private sector to make the jump themselves?
Great question. Ariane, should we start with you?
Sure. I think first, one of MCC's lessons learned from our very first set of compacts is really, especially our model, we have a fixed budget and a fixed implementation timeline. So you really need to engage the private sector during the compact development space to, one, understand who your potential partners are, and to, two, get their creative ideas and input, and to make sure that you build an adequate flexibility in terms of compact design to be able to bring in those partners and take advantages of opportunities. The world 7 years from now in the countries we're operating in is necessarily going to change, but one thing we know for sure is that the private sector in those countries are going to be driving quite a bit of that development. I will say our ultimate outcome is really poverty reduction through growth. So we're not looking at subsidizing private sector, we're looking at bringing in private sector as partners, and often we're supporting the government in terms of developing the right capacity to have kind of transparent, fair rules of the game. To be able to effectively, again, set up the right policy and institutional environment to successfully bring in private sector actors. So that's kind of general approach. We can go into some more examples in all of our countries, but it really starts from even validation of the constraints analysis. And I'll say in the case of Morocco, for example, industrial land is something that didn't necessarily come out easily from the economic data, but was very strongly cited through the private sector and civil society during the consultation. And so it made us go back, take a hard look, and really validate that, in fact, there was evidence behind that constraint. So it influenced the whole direction of the program.
Great.
We have another question from Twitter, and this will go to you again, Ariane. How does the Morocco Compact interact with the Let Girls Learn initiative? And where might MCC invest in secondary education and youth employment?
Sure. So I think MCC always takes a look at not just constraints, but how are those constraints felt by different populations. And so we always look at the sort of social and gender lens. And in Morocco, you have some particular challenges and also opportunities. So in terms of the secondary side, there's first a huge divide between the rural situation and the urban situation. So girls are particularly disadvantaged in rural settings. In fact, in some of the urban settings, the girls are performing much better in school than the boys. So the gender issue is, I think, on both sides. But certainly in terms of our program, we'll be looking at how do you first ensure access to schools. And sometimes that's even in infrastructure rehabilitation, that there's adequate facilities for girls, that there's adequate transport for girls. There's quite a high dropout rate for girls, particularly as they reach adolescence. And the reasons for that can be quite different depending on where you're operating. So really understanding and taking a flexible approach to understanding a local situation and addressing that dropout rate. And when we talked about performance metrics, one of the things that schools would be measured against is looking at that dropout rate. And then on the workforce access side, Morocco has a very low female labor participation of about 26%. So what are also those other barriers or constraints? And so not just stopping at the secondary schools, but really what's constraining girls from either going on to vocational training or being able to access the right jobs.
Thanks.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but there's at least one more question I want to pose to the panel, and that is, when we look at Liberia and Sierra Leone, we see two countries that are a little different from our usual partners, countries that are both emerging from civil war, unrest, and also from a major health crisis, Ebola. Evan and Chris Dunn, I'd love to hear about that and how maybe that changes the way we work there.
Sure, maybe I can start. Liberia is about a little over 11 years removed from what I'm sure you're all well aware of, quite a devastating civil war. It obviously had a huge human impact. It took quite a toll on the country's physical infrastructure as well, and in many respects, and particularly in the case of the electricity sector, it's really being rebuilt from the bottom up, from scratch. And I think from the standpoint of civil conflict, we look at some of these countries with a consideration towards capacity and development of institutions, key institutions that will own, manage, and be responsible for a number of new assets and physical infrastructure that MCC is contributing to, again, either rehabilitation of or new construction of. And again, in the case of Liberia, and specifically in the electricity sector, hydropower was a key piece of this, and unfortunately a sort of devastating consequence of the war and its total destruction, and now fortunately the opportunity to participate in the rehabilitation of that. To the second part of the question with respect to Ebola, and obviously Liberia and Sierra Leone were particularly hard hit by the Ebola crisis over the last 13 months or more. And fortunately, now quite successfully emerging from that crisis. And I think, amongst other things, in both cases, there was a recognition that certain systems could be strengthened, particularly in the healthcare sector, and that the economies in both of these countries were quite substantially hit by the health crisis. And I think it's important to underscore that MCC's involvement in Liberia and certainly in Sierra Leone are meant to really complement efforts that are specifically focused on addressing, I think, some of the health-related issues that emerged as a result of the Ebola crisis. Really, our focus is on long-term economic growth, and we're obviously aiming to focus in key sectors where we can really support sustainable long-term growth. And in Liberia's case, obviously the electricity sector and the road sector are quite critical for that. There's a tremendous amount of funding and work being undertaken now in Liberia in the health sector to support health system strengthening, rehabilitate physical infrastructure, hospitals, secondary clinics, train nurses, doctors, technicians, etc. And really it was our goal and our approach in working with the government of Liberia and also with other actors, and principally the other agencies within the U.S. government who were very responsive during the Ebola crisis and will continue to be responsive to the needs in the health sector, not to overlap or duplicate efforts, but really to focus on our key strengths as an institution and focus our funding where we can be a value add and where we can really contribute to some of the key sort of growth objectives of the country. So our investment is really coming at a critical time in Liberia, both as a result of the emergence after the war and now 11 plus years of sustainable democracy and quite good growth, but in the face of the setback of the last year as a result of the Ebola crisis. So we feel like it's a really key time to be investing in Liberia and certainly in the sectors that we're focusing on.
And I'll just add a few things. I mean, Sierra Leone, like Liberia, is about 13 years removed from, a brutal civil war. And despite sort of intervening years that saw 3 successful election cycles, a peaceful transfer of power, steady, relatively broad-based economic growth, at least until Ebola, in some ways the country still remains synonymous with that brutal civil war. And certainly the infrastructure and institutional constraints we design the program around and to alleviate are still being driven by the impacts of the sort of destruction caused and the real absence of governance for a period of years, all caused by the Civil War. And so, I think we've certainly designed the program with that in mind and thinking about how to rebuild these institutions and build capacity within these institutions and partner with the government. I think in one specific way as well, the program's focus, particularly on Greater Freetown, is in some ways a result of many of the migration patterns that have happened in the aftermath of the war, with Freetown and its urban and peri-urban areas greatly expanding and having an increasing share of the population, and in many ways having very frequently almost a total absence of access to some of these essential services. So certainly the focus on Greater Freetown in some ways was derived from understanding some of the lessons learned from the conflict, but certainly the impacts of the conflict and how it has changed the population patterns. And in the context of Ebola, obviously Sierra Leone is still just emerging, very much so, from the Ebola crisis. And I think first and foremost, our intention was to give the government the space that it needed and the other development partners to really mitigate and try to put an end to that crisis. And so certainly there has been a period of time where we were sort of partnering with the government in a quiet way as they did what they needed to do to make sure that this crisis could be stopped. But as Evan alluded to, what we've tried to do with the government and with other U.S. government entities and the other development partners is really try to design a suite of activities that are intended to directly mitigate some of the second-order impacts of the Ebola crisis, including access to some of these essential services, and really get Sierra Leone back on a growth trajectory, return the country to the growth trajectory that it was experiencing prior to the outbreak and prior to the collapse in commodity prices, which obviously had a huge impact on the economy.
I think we're out of time. I know we have a couple more questions. We will try to make sure that we answer them. Feel free to continue sending questions, and we can post all the answers online. I want to thank everyone for joining us both in person and online. We've had another great conversation. Stay tuned to MCC. Go to our website, mcc.gov, and we look forward to seeing you again in December, when we'll talk about our new country selections. Thank you.